World tennis number one Novak Djokovic has blamed, quote, human error for a mistake when filling out his travel declaration before entering Australia. It breached the country's strict laws on reporting travel history during the pandemic. And for more on that, let's cross live to our correspondent Greg Navarro in Sydney. So Greg, the immigration drama continues. What's next for Djokovic?
Well, there are really two scenarios that are going to play out. At best, Djokovic, the defending men's champion of the Australian Open, faces a less than friendly, welcoming crowd in Melbourne when he takes to the courts for the start of the Australian Open next week. At worst, he faces losing his visa and potentially being deported. Now, we are expecting to hear from Australia's immigration minister with a decision at some point today. We're told in the last 24 hours or so he's been reviewing additional information, additional documentation that is not helping Djokovic's case. That includes misleading information on travel declarations arriving in Australia, saying he hadn't been anywhere in the 2 weeks leading up to his arrival here, where it turns out, in fact, he had been in Spain during that time for part of the time. In fact, there are reports that Spanish authorities are investigating to see whether Djokovic has broken any crimes there. And there are lingering questions about whether Djokovic has breached isolation requirements in Serbia, as well as inconsistencies with the date of his COVID test. We do know that at least 1 or 2 days after finding out that he was COVID positive last month, he met with a journalist for an interview and actually took off his mask to pose for pictures at one point. Now, he has apologized, saying that was an error in judgment, but as I mentioned, none of this appears to be helping his case to remain, and it's fair to say that all of this has garnered a great deal of attention.
What he should is kick him out. What he will, I honestly, who knows? After hearing about what Djokovic said about how he made mistakes on his form and those little slips, I reckon he'll kick him out. No one can stuff up that badly on little things like that. Like, that's just pretty basic stuff. So yeah, I reckon he should and will boot him.
It's just it's really disappointing that Tennis Australia has allowed for this to happen, because the Australian Open is more than one tennis player.
It's certainly true, but at the moment all the attention is focused on that one player. Now, there are unconfirmed reports that Australia's government is leaning toward cancelling Djokovic's visa for a second time. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said rules are rules. The Deputy Prime Minister here echoing those comments, but you have to remember that Djokovic initially was given a medical exemption upon arrival to not only be here, but to participate in the Australian Open. Australia's government at some point found that they didn't like the way that was working out, that it breached Australia's ruling on people who are not vaccinated, and that's what got us to this stage. Now, if in fact the government does cancel his visa for a second time, Djokovic does have the option of bringing this all before a court once again, and could very well remain in the country until that is resolved. Brendan?
Greg, now let's take a look at the overall COVID situation in Australia. The country has reported the highest number of COVID deaths in more than 15 months. Tell us more about government measures to deal with this new hike.
Well, there really, as far as the federal government goes, we haven't heard from Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison in the last 24 hours or so. As you mentioned, while COVID numbers continue to skyrocket here in Sydney and across New South Wales, nearly 100,000 cases, are registered today. In the state of Victoria, tens of thousands of cases there, and a second straight day of a record number of deaths recorded within the last 24 hours. We do know that Australia's opposition leader has been out. He has been very vocal today talking about all of this. Remember that a federal election is just months away in this country. He's been critical of Australia's government's handling of the pandemic, from the vaccine rollout, which was very slow, to the moment a very big shortage of rapid antigen tests across this country. We do know hospitals are struggling, testing centers buckling under those skyrocketing numbers of cases as well. Supply chains have been disrupted across the country because so many workers are either testing COVID positive or there are close contacts and being forced to isolate. That's impacting supermarkets across the country in particular, where shelves are bare in some locations. In fact, we're told that in some stores, stores are imposing consumer limits on certain items as well. Now, state and territory government leaders are also struggling to come up with ways to try to slow the spread of the Omicron variant, which has rapidly really traversed across the country. Now, here in New South Wales, the government announced yesterday that if you test positive using a rapid antigen test, then you must register that positive test with the government. But people have pointed out that enforcing such a law would be extremely difficult. More importantly, just getting your hands on a rapid antigen test here in New South Wales and across many parts of the country at the moment is nearly impossible. Pendo?
Thank you very much. Our correspondent Greg Navarro in Sydney.